By morning, Rome still stood. The festival was over. The women were inside the city. The men who had failed to protect them were on the roads home. Romulus had what he wanted. The night before, his city invited its neighbors to a festival. Then the signal came. The women who had arrived as guests were seized. Livy says the games broke apart in alarm. Parents fled in grief. The women taken were despondent and indignant. Rome needed women to create families, but in doing so destroyed the families of others. Thus, Rome became a city hated by those that surrounded it. Romulus went around to the abducted women. He told them their parents were partly to blame because they had refused marriage with his people. He told them they would not be treated as captives. They would become wives. They would share property. They would have civil rights. They would become mothers of free children. Inside Rome, Romulus called it marriage. Outside Rome, their families called it theft. And those families were in mourning. But they did not keep their grief to themselves. They sent formal appeals to Titus Tatius, king of the Sabines. A stolen daughter was not only a family wound, it was proof that her father had been humiliated. And in the ancient world, such an insult required a response. The towns of Crustumerium and Temnae and Canina suffered heavily from the abduction. They waited for the Sabine king to act, but he was too slow for men already indignant. The smaller towns moved first, not with patience or strategy, but with rage. Canina, acting alone, attacked Roman territory. Romulus met them, scattered them, killed their king, and captured their city. Antemne followed, and was defeated. Crustumerium thought twice about attacking after seeing what had happened to the others. The lesson was simple. If the neighboring towns wanted to defeat Rome, they could not do it separately. At this point in the story, one woman steps forward. Her name is Hersilia. Livy calls her the wife of Romulus. However implausible, Plutarch wrote that she may have been the only married woman taken during the abduction. Hersilia asked Romulus to make peace with the women's parents and receive them into Roman citizenship. Many of the women's parents and relatives migrated to Rome. Rome did not have to wash away every enemy. It could absorb them. But the Sabines were different. The smaller towns had moved in anger. The Sabines moved with patience, keeping their designs hidden. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, had watched the smaller towns fail. He would not simply throw men at Rome. He would look for a weakness. He would find it from inside the city. Her name was Tarpeia. She was the daughter of the commander of the Roman citadel. The building stood at the top of the Capitoline hill, the strongest position above the settlement. If the Sabines could take it, they would take the high ground over Rome. According to the story, Tarpeia went outside the fortress to fetch water for religious rites. Titus Tatius found her and made a proposition. If she would let the Sabine army in, they would give her whatever it was that they wore on their left arms. And Tarpeia agreed to open the way. The details shift depending on the version, but in the story, the Sabines wore gold bands on their left arms. That was what Tarpeia thought she had bargained for. But the Sabines wore something else on their left arms too, their shields. When she opened the citadel, they kept their bargain. They threw their shields on her and crushed her to death. Later Romans linked her name to the Tarpeian rock, the cliff on the Capitoline from which traitors were thrown. Her story was remembered not as tragedy, but as a lesson. The Sabines held the Capitoline, while the Romans held the Palatine. Between them lay the low ground that would one day become the Forum. For now, it was a battlefield. The Romans formed below the citadel. They had lost the strongest position in the city. Now they had to take it back. The battle began with the Romans attacking upward, trying to recover the height they had lost. A Roman commander, Hostius Hostilius, fell. Then the line broke and fell back toward the gate of the Palatine. For a moment, the city's future seemed in doubt. Romulus himself was nearly swept away in the flight. He lifted his hands and called on Jupiter. But it was not Jupiter who entered the battlefield. It was the women. The women whose abduction had started the war. They ran into the space between the missiles, between fathers and husbands, between the homes they had lost and the homes forced upon them. They asked the men not to stain themselves with the blood of sons-in-law and fathers-in-law. The victims were forced to save the men who had trapped them. The leaders came forward. Terms were made. The Romans and Sabines became one people, with the seat of government in Rome. Romulus and Titus Tatius would share royal power. Plutarch says the Romans remembered the story in one more place, at the threshold. In Roman weddings, the bride did not step into her husband's house by herself. She was lifted over it. Plutarch says this was done in memory of the Sabine women, who had been carried into Roman homes by force and had not entered of their own will. Whether every later version of the custom comes from Rome is impossible to prove, but in Roman memory, it was a rite that originally began with force.